Acts chapter 2, verse 42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. These are four things that I think should characterize the church in every location, in all of time. Devoting themselves, talked about it last time. This is not casual. This is very intentional. Devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, the fellowship. What does that? Well, that means they devoted themselves to the relational connections. And then to the breaking of bread. Now, that could mean several things, but two big ones in my opinion. First of all, when people shared a meal in this day, the first century, that was often referred to as breaking bread. Let us break bread together, which I'd say, let's go to lunch, let's go to dinner. That makes sense. Okay, they if you're gonna be devoted to fellowship, to these relational connections, then kind of stands to reason eating together would be part of that. And I think that's legitimate. Some of the best conversations I've ever been in were over dinner, over lunch, over coffee. So I get that. And in fact, Jesus did quite a bit of business over meals. Okay. But there's this other aspect that breaking bread could have meant traditionally for, centuries, many centuries. The idea of breaking bread had to do with sharing communion. Well, that's not a hill to die on. It's just realizing if you're going to be devoted to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to the breaking of bread, it means there's bread involved. Now, when it talks about breaking of bread, that could refer back to how Jesus observed the Passover with the apostles on the night he was betrayed. The gospel writers describe how Jesus took bread and broke it. This was a prescribed part of the Passover meal, the Seder of the Passover meal. I think anybody who had a Jewish, certainly anybody who had a Jewish background, and others who understood Judaism would have, when the term the breaking of bread, they probably would have gone back to that. That was the deal. So, okay, I think it's not one or the other. I think it's probably both. I'm going to kind of run down a bunny trail here. Communion, what we have as communion, sometimes it's called the Lord's Supper, and whatever tradition you came from, it involves bread and wine or juice. When Jesus instituted it, he said, "As often as you do this, remember me." Now, some people take that to mean do it when you feel like it. I grew up in a tradition that it was every Sunday, every week, we took communion. I kind of like that. And part of the reason I like it is because I grew up with it. Here's another reason I like it, is because when we break the bread together in that way, we remember him in a particular way. And our lives are busy, and even if they're not busy, they are cluttered with all sorts of other things. And when we break the bread in communion, we put all that on pause. And Paul gives direct instruction about, how do you do this? What are you supposed to do? And essentially it comes down to, he said, a person must examine themselves. It is a self-reflection time, and it's a Jesus reflection time. I mean, there are people, I know of people that think, man, if I got to take communion every Sunday because that's how I get my sins rolled back for that previous week. I don't think that's what it's about. It wasn't about that for these first century Christians, because the transaction for salvation had already happened when they repented and were baptized. The breaking of the bread was this moment. Remember, the idea of them being devoted is included here. To be devoted to the breaking of bread in this communion sense is certainly the idea that we didn't just occasionally do it. I had a guy one time tell me, I just think if you take communion every Sunday, it becomes common. It loses its true value and impact. Well, for that guy, that might be true. But I said, so you only kiss your wife like, I don't know, every 2 weeks, every month, because in a sense, when we break the bread, when we observe communion, we embrace the Savior that we love, who loves us. There's an exchange of affection in that. There's got to be. Well, okay, I have pretty strong feelings about communion. And one last thing. Well, two quick things. One is, I grew up in a tradition where it was a teetotaler tradition. We used Welch's grape juice, not wine. And I have heard that people from my independent Christian church background who said, well, Jesus was, when he didn't do, that wasn't real wine. That was only grape juice. It was non-alcoholic. Wrong. I'm sorry. Well, I'm not really sorry. But that idea is in error. When Jesus broke the bread as they observed Passover, and he offered the cup, there was real wine in that cup. It was part of the Passover Seder. So if you want to go back to that, the grape juice is fine. Real wine is, if you want to go back to the beginning, that's what Jesus used. Now, there are good reasons that most of the churches I've been a part of used grape juice, not wine. When I was in Las Vegas, our senior pastor, Kevin Oder, gave a great short talk about this when he said, we use grape juice, and there's a big reason for it. Because many of the people in our church family are recovering from alcoholism, and it would be dishonoring to them to include the substance that they have to, if they're going to survive, they have to remove from their experience and from their practice. So we use grape juice. Okay. That makes sense to me. One of the gifts God gave my family and me was a close relationship with a man named J. Russell Morris. And I talked a little bit about him. He was held in a Chinese communist prison camp for more than a year when the communist revolution happened in China. He and his family had been in the southern part of China establishing churches. Of course, when Mao Zedong took over, the revolution happened and they exterminated the church. They did the best they could. They didn't accomplish their goal, but they did persecute the church. And Brother Morris was in this concentration camp for more than a year in solitary confinement. And his experience included Chinese torture. It was so heinous that when I begged him to tell me so that I could write it, that it would be preserved and we could pass it on to generations, he just couldn't. He told the story of how their daily, normal, everyday diet was weak, dirty soup and old, crusty, often moldy bread. It wasn't just like, that's pretty awful. It was just horrible. And he told that he held back a piece of bread and a little bit of the water that they gave him on Saturday evening, so that on Sunday morning he would have communion. Crusty bread, not very clean water. For him, this became the bread and the wine. Do this, Jesus said, to remember me. As often as you do that, he said, remember me. And Brother Morris did. It was that important to him. I'm not saying that if you want to go to heaven, you got to take communion every Sunday. I'm not. I am saying, though, the breaking of the bread, this experience of this moment of remembering Christ, his sacrifice, his suffering, his life. It's not just, another part of the service like we take the offering too. No. In some religious traditions, it's the point of the gathering. Well, I guess what I'm saying is don't minimize it. And there are times when it would be very wise to create a communion service outside of the church. You know what? You can do that. It doesn't have to be in the church. It could be in your home. And the implication here is it was in their homes. But one more aspect of these four things that the church did, we're going to talk about it next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.